talk on hope, she gave me a bemused look. After all, my favorite children's book is entitled The Death of a Wombat. My favorite novel is about a whiskey priest. And my favorite adult film is Francis Coppola's Apocalypse Now. As far back as I can remember, I have always prided myself on a certain hard-boiled realism. When my father headed out to the racetrack and gambled his paycheck on hopes of striking it big, I stayed home and watched my mother in the kitchen make spaghetti with ever smaller portions of meat. When my younger brother, the prodigal one, would break down at home and tearfully acknowledge he was wasting his life away on drugs, I saw his emotional confession as a ploy to play us, a dramatic declaration of repentance that lacked staying power. To me, Dennis sometimes shot up and crawled into a hole. Other times, he was kind and immeasurably good. That was Dennis. And I felt somewhere in my bones that was always going to be Dennis. I had, I thought, a nose for smelling out false hopes. When I went away to college and studied Marx and Freud, I was handed more advanced tools of suspicion that I could use to cut through the illusions. In this case, the false fronts of capitalism, bourgeois morality, and institutional religion. I became intoxicated by the idea that most everything was an appearance, a self-serving appearance at that. Navigating our world involved breaking through the various surface appearances to the less than impressive realities that lay beneath. Politics became coded rhetoric, religion an opiate, morality a mechanism of social control, history a justification of wrongful deeds written by the victors. Deconstruction was the order of the day, letting the air out of balloons that had been filled with fraudulent promises of hope. But of course, I'm simplifying my history. Things have always been more complicated than what I would wish. From as far back as I remember, I have always been a hopeless romantic who refused to live in the world as it is. As a boy, I sat in our small living room in the late Sunday afternoon watching the second football game of the day, those games matching up teams with strange names, such as the New York Titans, from that other league, the EFL. As I sat on the floor next to my father, who lounged in his recliner, I dreamed of becoming Lance Allworth, streaking down the sideline, hauling in touchdown passes from John Hadle. I also remember countless early mornings, lying in bed, feeling a palpable ache in my stomach as my dream world faded away. And I was forced to acknowledge that those riches my family and I had hauled in from some hidden treasures were trappings of another world, a world of fantasies that incomprehensibly had no connection to the world of vacationless summers and bikeless backyards. It was the fading away that hurt the most, that gradual shock of recognition that there was no gold in my bedroom, not a basketball in the closet. You see, even my efforts to name my hopes end in sadness. Not, I think, because I lack hope. If anything, I fear that I have too many unjustified hopes, but rather because I find much of the language of hope so perversively reassuring, offering answers before the question is even felt or understood. In a recent article in Psychology Today, Maria Lamia writes, "Having hope is to imagine a positive outcome." She goes on to state, The directive of many motivational principles is to visualize what you want and imagine positive outcomes so that your behavior is unconsciously structured to create them. I have always hated that way of talking about hope. The confident assumption that something like hope can be understood and managed with the same technical expertise as applying makeup. Hope becomes a commodity to be leveraged for one's self-improvement. Hope becomes another casualty of a pervasive self-help culture. Lamia, in that Psychology Today article, goes on to use a medical study to illustrate how, in her mind, hope functions. She writes, clinical drug trials are a good example of the power of hope. In clinical drug trials, a medication is compared with an inactive substance, commonly referred to as placebo. Recent studies of antidepressants doubt their efficacy when compared to a placebo in double-blind randomized clinical trials. What's most notable is that in clinical trials where the placebo is engineered to produce side effects, causing those who take it to believe that they are on actual medication, the efficacy of the placebo is similar to that of the medication. Lamia concludes, in a discussion of these studies, a friend suggested that rather than referring to such an inactive substance as a placebo, they should instead be called hope. I think I'm supposed to be heartened by these studies and the friend's suggestion for naming the placebo hope. I'm quite certain Lamia is. But I failed to find the identification of hope to a placebo all that comforting. Hope becomes a thing, an inactive substance, engineered to dupe us into greater health. Hope in this model is solely a calculated attitude, an orientation toward life. It is not rooted in anything beyond itself, except the conviction that hope itself has a power to act as an aid to our healing or to realizing our dreams of success. Hope, unhinged from any source, becomes another name for the power of positive thinking. Perhaps this view of hope is an inevitable byproduct of a technocratic society that deludes itself into thinking we can control almost everything. Heart attacks, our financial security, our children's happiness. Imagine yourself, blue-collar skinny kid from downriver Detroit, as an NFL wideout and engage in certain select behaviors, drink plenty of milk, lift weights, and watch as that hope ignores the laws of genetics and transforms that skinny boy into a 6'3", 205-pound receiver for the San Diego Chargers. Hope, it seems to me, can easily become something cowardly, a deception used to lessen the blows of life, a tool to make life more manageable, a device used to shield oneself from ugly realities. My son Daniel tells of a conversation he had with one of his Hungarian friends. Daniel had been living in Hungary for a few years, and while sitting at a bar one night, was asked by his friend, "Why are Americans smiling all the time? What the hell is there to smile about?" For Daniel's friend, the American propensity to smile seemed incongruous. After all, over the prior 6 decades, Hungary had been taken over by Nazi Germany, and its leadership and many of its citizens had cooperated in the transport of hundreds of thousands of Jews to death camps in Poland. When the war finally ended, the Soviet Union simply replaced the Nazis, as Hungary was forced into becoming a Soviet satellite. The Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye argues that all stories can be placed under one of 4 categories, including romance, tragedy, irony, and comedy. He argues that romance, the stories of the triumph of good over evil, is our first story. These are the stories we are told as children. Stories such as the Narnia Tales by C.S. Lewis, or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or any Disney tale. At the core, these stories assume that goodness lies at the heart of things. That as paper covers rock, so too does goodness cover evil and despair. We Americans, of course, love romances. We eat them and their hopeful visions of life like we scarf down buttered popcorn at the theater. But hope, in and of itself, is neither noble nor good. When we hope, we can act in bad faith just as we can act in good faith. There is something called misplaced hope, is there not? This past week, Michigan GOP Representative Tim Walberg said that he isn't concerned about the effects of climate change, if it exists, because God will, quote unquote, take care of it. There seems to be something craven and irresponsible in that expressed hope. I fear that I hope in irresponsible ways all the time. I direct my attention away from unpleasant realities. I collaborate in creating best-case scenarios. I imagine myself younger and healthier than what I am. I envision my students sincerely engaged in every major paper they write, avoiding the unpleasant prospect that as I sit in front of their drafts, marking up their papers with comments, instructing them how they could reorganize this, or add that, or delete this to make their papers stronger, I may care more about their writings than many of them do. To acknowledge widespread apathy and indifference in my students would be too devastating, too demoralizing for me. So I maintain the fiction of engagement. And because I do, I probably receive more commitment from my students, more buy-in than I would otherwise. That's true. But the mechanism used to achieve that increased devotion, I think, is suspect. I do these tricks of the mind every day. One gracious act towards me colors my entire day. Not because I'm good, but because life feels better when I'm looking for the good. I like the feeling of being hopeful. It can become almost like a drug. And my incessant looking for the good can, I am sure, cause me to see people and their pain for what it is, in itself, without my need to hope beyond their pain and their confusion. Hope, as defined by our religious tradition, isn't simply an act of positive thinking, nor is it a reassuring conviction that life is, for the most part, pleasant and good. Rather, it is an attitude rooted in what the church sees as an objective reality. The decisive triumph of Christ over the powers. A victory that, although not fully evident in our world, is inevitable. A hope not just in the future, but in the current era, as the already but not yet. Peter calls it a living hope, something that has the power to engender life. In the midst of numerous references to an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, Peter, in chapter 3, verse 15, asks each of us to be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is within you. A few Sundays ago, Naomi answered that call and offered her well-thought-out reasons for that living hope. I fear that my way of answering that question would disappoint the Peter whose voice I hear in that admonition. There is, I think, a strong tendency to see religion today in existential terms, more fitting of main characters of a novel or a play or a film than of humans as they actually live out their lives in the everyday world. Storytelling, in the West at least, focuses its lens on the individual. Individuals that are put in critically important situations in which they must make choices that utterly define them. The same is true, I think, in religion today. Especially in Protestant traditions, it is the individual that works out their salvation. The emphasis is on the individual and their choices. Don't we Anabaptists, after all, withhold baptism until the age of reason and consent? And once we enter the fold, we individual believers are more and more handed over countless questions that now become ours to answer. Do we believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, in the ransom theory of atonement, or the satisfaction theory? Is there a heaven? Is it possible to believe that a loving God could create hell? It is as if we have become the main characters in a novel or a film. The spotlight is on the individual. We have become Hamlet, Hester Prynne, Bruce Wayne, those larger-than-life figures whose interior landscapes of deliberation and decision-making dwarf the outer world in which they live and move and have their being. In these stories, we are duped by narrative devices that inflate the main character's independence and place in the world. The cinematic close-up becomes a metaphor for the single-minded attention given to the isolated individual acting out their fate. To my mind, this attention to the individual fails to respect the countless ways that we live in community, that we believe in community, that we hope in community. We are always swimming in waters that we ourselves did not channel, buoyed by flotation devices we ourselves did not create. We are part of something much bigger than ourselves, and we rightly defer to voices that speak better than we do, to old stories that baffle us, yet somehow still define us, to theological discussions that both shape our ascents and our rebellions. So how do I give an answer to the reason for the hope that is within me? I answer by pointing to good work being done near and far, by martyrs that will be remembered far beyond their deaths, and by common, everyday folks like you and me, who in our best moments kindly answer that patient's question for the third time that day, or come by a friend's house when their dog dies. There is no dramatic music playing when we do what we do, no cinematic close-ups. Most of the time, it's just us, too tired to be really effective, too self-absorbed to be really good, but buoyed by the hope that something good is happening beyond our ability to see or to act. That whatever good we think we are initiating is but a piece of a much larger goodness that was begun long before we came into this world. And all of us, and all of this, even the doubting, the failures, the chilling silences, are part of the work being done by a God who will not forsake us, nor the world. So we hope all the time. Oftentimes driven by pride or selfishness or cowardice, we hope in bad faith, and our hopes are nothing more than the power of positive thinking. Other times, driven by compassion and love, we hope in good faith. And as Peter says, we are born into a living hope, a hope that can never perish, spoil, or fade.
God guide these gifts in directions that bring light and hope in darkness. Amen. We have comments in response to